Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight, part 2 of our 2021 legislative wrap-up. Yesterday, we covered a lot of ground on what the legislature did this year. Today, we focus on 3 areas: police reform, education, and taxes. But right now, we'll start with police reform. Joining us now in studio is Lex Scott, the organizer for Black Lives Matter Utah, and via Zoom is Nguyen Adams, Executive Director for the Utah Fraternal Order of Police. Thank you both for joining us on the show. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rosie.
Lex, we'll start with you. When you take a comprehensive look back at this year's legislative session and the bills that were passed in regards to police reform, what are your thoughts? Was enough done? Was it a good start? Or were you disappointed?
Well, it's always fun to see any police reform bills, right? Because that's not something that we have really seen in the past. So it felt really good to see all of the legislators pushing for police reform. Did we pass enough bills? No, we didn't. Did we pass bills that were necessarily life-changing, world-changing? No, but we did pass some good bills. HB 237, HB 84, HB 158, just to mention a few of those.
Nguyen, let's turn to you. What did you think about the police reform bills that came out of this year's session?
Well, there was a lot of energy coming into the session, and like Lex mentioned, a lot of different bills. We do see police reform bills every single year, but this year obviously had a few more than in a normal year. I was pleased with what came out the other side. Those bills and those legislators that were able to bring together a lot of different stakeholder voices and get a lot of agreement on these difficult issues did very well. And the bills that weren't able to didn't pass. And that's a pretty standard outcome in the Utah legislature.
Lex, let's talk about SB 106, which set up uniform use of force standards across the state. Does this fit in the idea of police reform in your mind? Why or why not?
It's important to have a standard use of force policy. Every agency has a different use of force policy, lethal force policy, excessive force policy. And if it's correct in my mind, this didn't really set the use of force. It basically said that there must be a standard use of force. And so I'm very curious to see what they choose as their standard for use of force, but it is important that we have a standard use of force policy.
Good follow-up questions that we could bring up in the future. Nguyen, what about you? What do you think about this bill?
Yeah, Utah Post is in charge of training, certifying, and decertifying officers, and importantly, for many, many decades, has set the use of force standards. Now, use of force, the minimum standards are actually set constitutionally and by this U.S. Supreme Court and Utah Supreme Court. And so I anticipate that the minimum standards by Post will be based upon those. But it is good to get a consistent read on that across the state.
Nguyen, we'll turn to you first for this next question. What were some bills passed that you were most satisfied with during this legislative session?
There's a couple. Angela Romero, a Democratic representative, and Senator Andrigg, a Republican, both had separately data collection bills that are quite good. It's one of our long-standing policy desires in Utah is to get robust data collection across the state that's standardized so that we can have some numbers to actually base our policies on. And those bills passed with overwhelming majorities through the session, and so I'm excited to see those.
I know that Lex had already mentioned the bills that she liked earlier in the show, so we'll turn to the next question. Nguyen, this question is also for you. We know that there were a number of police reform bills that did not make it through this session. What type of legislation would you like to see returned or get addressed during the next session?
Well, one of the bills we sponsored was from Representative Mike Winder. It unfortunately didn't get heard at the last minute during the crunch. The Senate wasn't able to get to it. What that bill would do is diversify some of the seats at Utah Post Council to include voices from organizations like the NAACP and labor organizations to represent line officers. I think it's important that that organization that's so critical to shaping policy and outcomes in Utah have more outside and officer voices on it.
Lex, same question for you. What didn't pass that you wanted to see pass? And do you have plans to pursue that as legislation again?
our independent oversight of police bill did not pass, and our body cam bill didn't pass. So we, again, do not want police officers to be allowed to investigate their own crimes and find themselves innocent. So we want independent oversight. And we also want all body cam footage released within 10 days of every officer involved shooting, unedited with sound. So we're not going to wait until the next legislative session. We're just going to launch some ballot initiatives and allow Utah to vote on those things.
Could you give us a preview? Which initiatives might we see as ballot initiatives in the future?
I mean, Black Lives Matter currently, while I'm sitting here, is having our ballot initiatives meeting because I double booked myself.
Oh. But you love us, right? That's why you're here.
I love Rosie. I love Rosie. You will definitely see the body cam one that will basically allow Utah to vote whether body cam footage should be released within 10 days of every officer involved critical incident. And then the second one, I'm just going to keep that under my hat for now, and because we need to decide and we need to really work through the process on that one.
You're doing what we do in news, is keeping viewers curious and teasing, right, what's to come. All right, let's get some final thoughts. Ian, I'll turn to you first. Anything else that you'd like to mention in this discussion that we haven't yet talked about?
No, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you hearing from the voices of officers in Utah. We'll look forward to the next session.
Thank you, Ian. And what about you, Lex? Final thoughts?
Well, the Justice in Policing Act passed the House of Representatives for the second time in Washington, D.C. That is the dream police reform bill, and we are all hoping that people will contact their senators so that it will pass the Senate. If it passes the Senate, we will get substantive reforms across this entire country. So we're all praying that that will pass the Senate soon.
And one thing is for sure is our conversation, discussion, and the work that we need to do on police reform there's still a lot more to come. You've been hearing from Lex Scott, organizer for Black Lives Matter, and Ian Adams, executive director of the Utah Fraternal Order of Police. Lex and Ian, thank you again for joining us on the show to share your perspectives. It was great to have you both.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rosie. Good night.
Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on the Utah 2021 legislative wrap-up. We've just heard from two guests about the police reform bills that passed in this year's session. We now turn to education. Joining us now via Zoom is Chase Clyde, the Director of Government Relations for the Utah Education Association. Chase, thanks for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rosie.
Chase, funding for education went up this year, and it happened early on in the session. Also, the weighted pupil average went up. What does all of this mean?
Well, not to oversimplify it, but what does it mean? It means a boatload of new money is going into public education this year. And we owe the legislature a huge thank you for making a 6% investment increase into the weighted pupil unit. And for all the non-nerds out there, that's kind of the basic school funding formula here in Utah. In addition to that, they fully funded student growth and also put in some one-time money to kind of help us address some of the funky enrollment fluctuations we've seen as a result of COVID from this past year. As well as a huge chunk of money that's going to go to give educators and other school employees bonuses.
And I think any money that we can get for education is always a good thing. Now, SB 107 came out because Salt Lake City School District was primarily online. It originally removed the district from receiving pandemic bonuses, but it died after about 7 substitutions. Let's talk about this process. What do you think it says about local control and the session this year? And will all Utah teachers and staff members get the bonus now?
Well, it's an interesting subject, and I'll tell you why. We're celebrating these historic increases in funding, but Senate Bill 107 that you mentioned was kind of one of the bummer bills, as I call it. I think that it was bad policy to try and usurp local school district authority and kind of issue top-down mandates that really diminish local control. It's bad policy, it was bad politics, and unfortunately, it was the Salt Lake educators that kind of got stuck in the middle of a political fight. And for a while there was some legitimate concern that they wouldn't be receiving their bonuses. Now, for the most part, it's kind of all worked out. And yes, all educators and schools, all educators that are working in school buildings with students will receive that bonus. So that's another victory for students, even if it was, a little challenging with the legislature. And we let them know that we didn't love that bill, but it looks like it's worked out relatively.
I'm glad we got past that hiccup, because I remember teachers in the Salt Lake City School District just felt so singled out. Okay, let's turn now to the proposed bills that had to do with curriculum, gun safety, and sex ed. What do you think happened with these bills, and how does it relate to the argument about pandemic bonuses?
Well, what's been interesting about these curriculum bills is to look at it in kind of the broader context from a public policy perspective. Is it the role of the legislature to be passing bills to implement curriculum at a school level? We think those decisions are best made at the local school district level and with the State Board of Education. The gun safety bill you mentioned, we opposed that one because we thought, well, if a school district really wants to do that, they can do that on their own. We were supportive of the sex education bills because all those bills did is they tweaked the state law to make it so local school districts have more autonomy and, frankly, permission from the state to address some more comprehensive sex education. And if local districts want to explore those options, they would have been able to. But to answer your question, all of the bills related to the gun safety and gun firearm bill for schools, and then the sex education bills, they all failed. So that's kind of where those landed. But I think it's an interesting discussion talking about what the legislature's role is in curriculum.
We have about 30 seconds left, enough time for one more question. We've talked a lot about local control, independent district choices, and autonomy. Let's talk about Dottie Nguyen. She was a student board member for the Salt Lake City School District. She spoke at a committee hearing about lowering the voting age for school board members to 16 years old. Now, ultimately, the bill didn't pass, but Dottie said that she will be back next session to try again. What did you think about her proposal?
Well, I think the policy was a good policy. And I will say Dottie is a fabulous young woman, and she gave a rock star presentation. And I think we'll be discussing that bill during the interim and going forward. And I hope it comes back next year, and we were happy to support it. But it's unfortunate that it didn't pass.
I know, but I think just having her there in the process at the committee meeting
was awesome.
opened a can of worms. And I think that's a win right there, right? And hopefully we'll see her back again next year. All right, you've been hearing from Chase Clyde, the Director of Governmental Relations with the Utah Education Association. Chase, thanks for your time tonight. It was great to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Rosie.
Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight as we wrap up the 2021 legislative session. Earlier, you heard reaction about police reform and education. We now turn to taxes. Joining us in studio is Rusty Cannon, the Vice President for the Utah Taxpayers Association. Rusty, thank you for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Rusty, we'd like to start with your view on taxes in Utah. What are your underlying principles when thinking about taxation and tax reform?
Well, the Utah Taxpayers Association has been around for almost 100 years. We'll celebrate our 100-year anniversary in 2022, founded in 1922. And the goal of the nonprofit all along has been to advocate for good, fair tax policy in Utah, low tax burden, efficient and low government spending, and that's what we've been advocating for almost 100 years now.
Now, have any of your views been modified or impacted during the course of the pandemic when more government resources have been necessary?
No, our principles have stayed the same. In fact, the fruit of the labors from the Utah legislature and organizations like ours really bore fruit in this recession or in this pandemic, to where the conservative nature in which Utah is, the way it's run, and our tax policies really came to light. Our state is in much better position relative to other states, And our tax policies of low and fair taxes, a fairly low income tax rate, generally low property taxes, and a fairly low sales tax rate as well, really bore fruit in keeping tax revenues steady in the state throughout the pandemic. Much to people's surprise, sales tax revenues actually rose in Utah through the pandemic, and so that's put Utah in a very good position.
Let's step back to 2019. At that time, the legislature took on tax reform in a big way, but it ultimately failed. Do you think that process had any lingering spillover into this year's session?
Well, that's a great question. I think legislators realize that when you go through tax reform, you do need to take the time to inform citizens and voters as much as possible. They went to great efforts in that effort in 2019, but ultimately that effort failed for a few different reasons. I think that perhaps what they learned is focused generally on tax cuts, which we saw in this session. Generally just a focus on tax cuts only, and no tax hikes per se in any major area. And so I think legislators really have dialed in on the right areas. There's still many areas to still address, but it did certainly have an effect.
Now, tax relief for individuals came out in the form of 3 bills. Could you help us learn more about this group of bills? Who is it for, and what you think about those bills?
Yeah, so 3 separate ones for individuals. The first one was a Social Security tax cut, House Bill 86, that it gives an additional tax benefit to those receiving Social Security. So that will help senior citizens that are collecting Social Security. The second one was a bill to exempt military retirement benefits from taxes. Utah was actually one of only about 4 states in the nation that still taxed those benefits. So that will eliminate tax there and hopefully attract those types of individuals to come to the state and remain in the state. And the last one was a restoration or a further restoration of the dependent exemption that was lost to Utah families in the federal tax reform of 2017. And so Senate Bill 152 actually restored a good portion of that benefit back to taxpayers. And so for those with dependents, they should see a lowering of their state income tax bill going forward.
There was also another bill, SB 18, that helps small businesses. What can you tell us about that bill? Yeah,
that is a great bill. That was from Senator Harper, and that one will raise the exemption that businesses have when it deals with personal property tax. Your tables, your chairs, your fixtures, other than real property, they do actually have to pay property tax on. It's quite a burden to count your chairs, your tables, your forks, and those kinds of things to assess for property tax. And that raises the exemption from $15,000 to $25,000. That'll actually exempt an additional 39,000 small businesses in Utah from that tax going forward. That's about half of them. And so that will really go a long way to easing the burden on small businesses. And we were very happy about that bill.
I think anything that we can do to help those small business owners, especially right after that pandemic that we just dealt with in the past year, is good news. Now, Rusty, was anything passed that you felt had too big a tax burden attached to it?
No, they did a really good job this time of focusing on tax cuts, and generally there weren't any bills that had large tax increases, or virtually any tax increase for that matter. Basically, they did a good job on focusing on the right things. There were some bills that did need to cross the finish line that would be additional tax relief that we had hoped for, a general income tax rate cut that was not passed, and some additional help for seniors as well on property tax. But that's something we can work on in the future.
Sounds good. Sounds like you were satisfied with this year's legislative session.
Yeah, it was a good session. We still have a lot of work to do, and the federal issues going on now are going to create a lot of issues going forward. So our work is not done.
Work is not done. We'll be seeing from you, or seeing and hearing from you, maybe again in the future. All right, you've been hearing from Rusty Cannon, Vice President of the Utah Taxpayers Association. Rusty, thanks for coming on the show tonight and sharing your insight with us.
Happy to be here. Thank you.